Fury versus Arms, one weapon versus two weapons. Who has more damage? Who can take more damage? Which one of the two is more fun to play and destroys content better? All of these burning questions will be answered, and by the end, with all the research and data, we will figure out who is the better spec. Let's kick it off with the damage, since I know you don't give a flying fuck about anything else if the damage sucks. Well, let me tell you, it's not havoc damage, but it's good enough where both Arms and Fury can clear Mythic Farok and keys close to 30s. In terms of actual DPS, let's take a look at some examples. Everbloom is a good place to start as a Mythic Plus key and the best dungeon to look at because it's green and we should all touch grass a bit more instead of debating who has the biggest This particular key was a 27 Everbloom with no augmentation evokers. The Arms Warrior finished with 409k DPS while the Fury cranked a total of 363k. Now these are of course numbers and Arms is bigger. Size doesn't always matter outside situations where it does. Arms is clearly crushing it in this case, and no, the dungeons were not rigged, just picked the best 27 Everblooms done as of recording this video. There are likely X amount of situations where Fury can overtake Arms, where Arms can do double that of Fury, and so on. However, if the best Arms on a 27 Everbloom can match and surpass the best Fury on a 27 Everbloom, then we can clearly draw a line here. We can also look at rating DPS. For this, I chose to look at Smolderon logs. Smolderon is a common wall that you need to bust through as a guild and a generally accepted difficult boss where individual performance and skill matters across the entire raid. We can look at the top 10 warriors crushing Smolderon and seeing Arms once again take the cake. And I was also prepared for some of the comments coming our way. This is also the same top 10 warriors but with no PIs or other external buffs. I do admit that I didn't go to each of these individual fights and match the amount of uptime each warrior has had of augmentation buffs, whether it overlapped with their cooldowns properly or the Smolderon vulnerability phase and so on. I didn't do it because I don't want to lose my sanity, mostly, but also since exceptions and fringe situations can happen always, and as long as we look at the larger segment that can even out these situation bumps, we can still get a clear picture. Fury is still a more popular spec and still populates Mythic Farok kills more than Arms, and that's very likely not because of its higher damage potential. Fury also clears keys 1 to 2 levels higher than Arms across the board, which also points out that the raw overall DPS at the end of an encounter is not everything. Our patrons are though, because they are supporting the content that we make. And if you want to support these types of videos and more to come in the future, consider going to patreon.com/MarcelianOnline or clicking the link down below and check out our Patreon page. You don't have to do anything and check it out because there are actually some goodies and perks that you can get by signing up and being a part of the team. First of all, you can get early access to some of our videos, access to bloopers that are only available to patrons, and also maybe the coolest thing ever is 4K wallpapers with your character's transmog customized personally for you, made by the very own Marcelian. Thank you for considering supporting our content, and let's talk about Arms versus Fury, because Fury is just the embodiment of pure consistency. It's essentially the outlaw spec of warrior. The rotation is exactly the same whether you are fighting a big dungeon pack or a dangerous boss. In AoE, you weave in more whirlwinds to be able to cleave, but the rest of your rotation will remain the same. While in single target, you may weave in a whirlwind here and there, still, since the playstyle kind of forces you to do it. More on that later. Alternatively, Arms has a bigger burst damage profile. The way the cooldowns work for both of these specs give them both some burst, sure, but Arms just takes it to a whole new level. Actually, it's not too far ahead of Fury, but noticeably far enough where if you want more burst because packs die quicker, then Arms is your go-to. In prolonged fights where you have consistent uptime on your targets, Fury will start to slowly win out. There's one more benefit to Arms, however, and that is its execute damage. The execute phase has always been an Arms staple, but funny enough, Arms hasn't beat Fury on execute 100% of the time in the history of World of Warcraft. Now, however, Arms is taking the cake and eating it too. Arms is also the cleave king, where on fights like Council, it smokes Fury once again. So, in conclusion, Arms has niche situations where it will smoke Fury on damage, and if all else is equal, can still out DPS Fury. But Fury instead is very reliable through its consistency. If shit hits the fan, Fury is much more likely to perform, while Arms can be toppled over if it's forced to do a mechanic in the middle of its burst window. Damage is obviously important. Without damage, stuff just doesn't die and you don't get fat loot. But what happens when the damage goes back and forth where it's not clear which of the two specs will win out? We then look at other, more abstract things like utility. I'm using utility as an all-encompassing word to refer to both crowd control and survivability, which often are linked. Since both of these specs are still warriors at the end of the day, the overlap on a lot of utility is very obvious. Thankfully, both Arms and Fury have builds that let them select most, if not the same, crowd control and tankiness abilities. I am of course talking about things like Spell Reflect, Shockwave, Intimidating Shout, and so on. So from a standpoint of who does it better, they both do it the same. The difference starts to hit with the defensives, tankiness, and general niche kits. Let's look at Arms first. The unique defensive that it has over Fury will be Die by the Sword, which provides you with a 30% damage reduction and 100% parry chance. And the parry chance is what you will want to exploit, since this mechanic lets you do stuff like completely immune the Blade Storm of this boss in Morozon's Rise. It will immune all physical attacks that imply you being consistently hit with a weapon to the face. There are other melee mobs in the game that do swings or blade storms where this defensive is good. More so because of how this works, you can do something else that Fury cannot, and that is to actually tank. There are bosses in the raid that swing at players, like Igira, which you can take to the face and immune if this is something that needs to be done, which it should never be, but it is an option you have. You can also deliberately taunt a target and pop your Die by the Sword and tank it for a few seconds. This can help your tank get back on their feet, or worse, if your tank died, you can use it to hold the line while someone combat resurrects the fool. Very niche indeed, but when it is necessary, the chances are you will save your group from wiping. And that's definitely something Fury cannot do, since the Fury version of this is Enraged Regeneration, which still gives 30% damage reduction, but instead of parry, you get an extra 20% health restoration on your bloodthirsts for the duration. Helpful, but it ain't no 100% parry, I'll tell you that much. Still, Fury is noticeably tankier than Arms across the board. First of all, your bloodthirsts will consistently heal you for 3% of your max health every time you cast them. You have more health than Arms because you are equipping an extra two-handed weapon which contributes its stamina, on top of the other stats, to your total pool of power. Not only that, but because of the War Pain talent, you also gain 10% damage reduction while you are enraged. And you are enraged almost 100% of the time if you play correctly. Sure, Arms has Seasoned Soldier, which gives it essentially 10% avoidance, but that's only AoE damage, not direct as well, so it's a weaker version of Warpaint still. All of these things add up to an overall lower intake of damage for Fury, especially in raids where it could matter more when fights are usually longer. The extra health and passive damage reduction definitely helps in high keys as well. Sure, not everyone is pushing 29s and 31s like these magnificent beasts, but the reality remains where one-shot situations can stop you from being able to play a key. Fury is less likely to encounter this obstacle, and most likely why it can push keys higher than Arms and kill Farok more, even though the damage output is slightly lower. If anything, this proves that there is more to a spec than the number of the DPS meter. It's nice to have all of these tools, the damage, the tankiness, the utility, but what if you don't push content where every percentage matters? What if all of these are nice but not really that important? What else is there to these two specs? The playstyle, of course, or rather, how fun are these to play? It's hard to talk about this particular section without being subjective, because fun is an individual thing and people enjoy different things differently. I can, however, roughly go over how both Arms and Fury play and that can turn on some lights in your head on which one to choose. Starting with arms, again, the playstyle is similar to how it has been for some time, if you played it before. And by that I mean it is slower than Fury and a bit more methodical. This is mainly because your rage comes from your weapon swings most of the time, and that's not something you can actively influence by pressing a button, though a Fury generates rage with bloodthirsts, for example. Sure, charging in also generates rage, and you still get rage passively from different sources or bits from other abilities, but that's a small amount compared to your auto attacks. Because of that, you usually don't spam buttons like Fury since you risk running out of rage before your Mortal Strike comes off cooldown. Outside of that, Arms has a much more interesting cooldown combo that you go through. That usually implies you charging in, maybe hitting a Thunderclap to put some rends out, and following it with a Warbreaker for your big damage increase. After this, it depends on your talents, but the arguably flashier and more engaging build will likely see you pop Avatar, which also casts Bladestorm at the same time. Once this is done, you fire your Dragon's Roar to beef it up with your Hurricane buff. Use an Empowered Whirlwind under the same buff, and then pop your actual Bladestorm to extend and maintain the Hurricane buff again, after which you will try to squeeze in another beefy Whirlwind. When all of these are on cooldown, you will play a cleave game with Sweeping Strikes, Thunderclap, and the occasional Whirlwind. This would be your downtime, which is arguably more boring but still engaging since you are actively changing small parts of your rotation based on what little cooldowns you are using. Other builds move away from Bladestorm or changes what your avatar does, simplifying the rotation a bit more or even adding spells like Cleave into your kit. The variety is actually nice and keeps you from getting bored. Fury, on the other hand, keeps things very simple. The build and playstyle is almost the same, with the biggest exception being that you play Dragon's Roar in dungeons and Spear of Bastion in raids. Other than this, the playstyle is similar, simpler, but also less stressful. Also faster, much faster, about 9 more actions per minute faster. Although I advise you take this with a grain of salt. A fast-paced spec is enjoyable in and of itself. You don't have to wait for anything, except the odd moment when your Bloodthirst is unavailable and you use Whirlwinds as fillers, even in single target, which I mentioned earlier in the video. The tier set has contributed a lot to this simplicity, which has been received with mixed opinions. Personally, I'm not a fan of the overly simplified playstyle, but sometimes I just cannot be asked to time cooldowns, align them right, weave in cleaves and extra defensives, or even think. Sometimes it's just Zug Zug time, and no spec does Zug Zug better than Fury Warrior. But one comes close, and that is Outlaw, the undisputed fastest DPS spec in the game, and luckily for you, we already have a video out that you can check and find out why Outlaw is so goddamn good.